The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is Cultural Witness in a Fractured Age.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Created in the Image of God show. I'm your host, Wade Franson. Each week, we interview the hidden leaven, sometimes not so hidden, that is doing the work of transforming society, transforming individuals, transforming our common understanding and experience of the divine. And today we have a very special guest who comes from over the pond, Great Britain. His name is Graham Tomlin, and he's a British theologian. He's the author and former Church of England. He's an author and former Church of England bishop, the editor-in-chief of seenandunseen.com, which is an effort to further his work that he has been doing for some time, which is to help the church speak more clearly and imaginatively into common contemporary public life. He previously served as Bishop of Kensington in the Diocese of London from 2015 to 2022, and became a key pastoral voice in the wake of certain tragedies in the UK. He spent many years in theological education at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, and has a number of other credentials to his credit. Rather than going on about them, let's meet the man. Welcome to the studio, Graham.
Nice to be here, Wade. Thank you very much for the invitation. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, I am as well. I've been really looking forward to this, and we've had a couple of scheduling issues along the way, but we're now here finally doing this. So, Graham, as we always like to do in this show, we like to hear about your creation story. We like the audience to get to know sort of the real you and understand how you came to be focused on the things you did, by understanding who your parents were, where you were born, circumstances that molded and shaped you before you took that sort of leap into adult life and grabbed the bull by the horns to accomplish something.
Yeah, well, happy to tell something of the story. So I was born in Bristol in the West Country of England. My dad was a pastor. He was a Baptist minister. And my mom was from Ireland, from the west of Ireland originally. My parents had met in Dublin. They came over to the UK, and so I kind of grew up there. So I kind of grew up within the church. I grew up going to church. I grew up in those early years, being taught the Christian faith and taught to believe it as you do in a Christian home. You grow up with it, with your mother's milk. And so, like many people like many children in Christian homes, I grew up with a very implicit faith, something that was just part of my life all the way through. And I guess when I hit my sort of teenage years, that I began to, as you do, you begin to kind of question these things. Not everyone does. Some people just sail quite neatly through their teenage years, and faith grows gradually. But many people, I think, in my experience, hit those teenage years, and there's a bit of turbulence, and faith is questioned, and faith is upturned a little bit. And that was certainly true for me. And I think a lot of people never find that faith again, and they kind of drift into an agnosticism or an atheism that lasts for the rest of their lives. But anyway, around the middle of my teenage years, 15, 16, I went through my teenage rebellion, which wasn't so much sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was more reading Nietzsche was my sort of thing that I did, to rebel against my parents. And I went through a period where I definitely would have thought that I was an atheist. I would have said, definitely, if you'd asked me, I do not believe in God. I think it was largely occasioned by looking at Christians that I knew, maybe a couple of Christians at school who seemed to me to live one kind of life on the church, a completely different kind of life outside the church. And I thought, wow, this is very hypocritical. I was very judgmental. Maybe I still am, but that was a kind of, I look back on with some shame at the way I kind of, cast judgment upon my, Christians that I knew at that stage. But anyway, for various reasons, part of the reading, part of the people that I knew, I kind of drifted away from Christian faith. But my parents kind of kept me going to church. And I suppose that they said, okay, that's fine. If you don't want to believe it, that's fine. But we'd like you while you're here to just keep on going to church, which I kind of did. And I suppose what that did is over time, I would go to church and I would read the Bible, trying to find the mistakes in it. But what it did do is it kind of exposed me to a kind of adult form of Christian faith. So I think what I'd rejected at the age of 16 was a very childish form of Christian faith, one that was fine for me when I was 10 or 11. But was no longer adequate for me as a kind of growing teenager, thinking for myself. And what I had to do was to rediscover that there was much more to this faith than I thought there had been. And I was drawn back into Christian faith. I mean, partly, I guess, by my parents' prayers, but also by a group of Christian people that I did know, whose lives did impress me quite a bit. And for me, there was never a kind of sudden blast moment of, like St. Paul on the Damascus Road. But it was more a gradual period of over about a 3-month period, going from thinking, well, I'm pretty well not a Christian. I know I'm an atheist. I don't believe in this at all. So over a period of time, beginning to think, well, maybe I do believe this after all. Maybe I'm beginning to be drawn back into it. And you kind of see something, looking back on it, something of the hand of God drawing me back into faith at that stage. But that's really the kind of journey I took during those teenage years. That's something in my background story.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I jotted down a couple of notes that I'd love to sort of dig into a little bit, because I think there are some common universal themes here that bear unpacking a bit. You mentioned a few things. One, which is that some people, just continue along the path that they were given, and you use the term mother's milk, which is fascinating. My father, who recently passed away, and I'm bringing him to my mind a lot of times to sort of honor him, the positive things about him. One of the things that I always laugh about when I think, he has these little bits of really brilliant humor, right? And one of them was, when I would drink my coffee with milk in it, he would say, "You're not weaned."
Yeah.
It just sort of encapsulates sort of that father, looking down on the son, but it's in a funny way. But then Paul talks about this, right? He talks about, you're not weaned, basically. You're still drinking milk. And then he says, strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. We may come back to that. It's a theme I keep bringing up to understand how various theologians view this. But what I want to highlight right here is that sort of coming of age. And you mentioned a child-ish faith, right? We're supposed to have childlike faith, but not childish faith, right? It's one way to put it. And within that, it was the hypocrisy, and then later the lack of hypocrisy that was instrumental in you moving away and then coming back. And I'm going to add one more layer to this and then invite you to sort of share your reaction and thoughts. You mentioned, critical judgment that you now see as having been unhelpful and regret and changed. And I often think of the work of God, which he's doing, transforming us, and then the work of the devil, which is to accuse the brethren, right? And it's where he finds occasion and opportunity to leverage that to work against the work of God is in exactly that hypocrisy that we all have to some degree. And you then mentioned later, you looked at some examples and you looked at them positively, and they brought you back towards God. Bottom line, and this is so obvious, fundamental, and for me, kind of common sense, and yet it took me decades to get to this point, that John 13:35 says, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another." So in looking at your background and me adding sort of those thoughts, just jump back into that and and react to what I've just shared, and is any of it true, and how does that relate to other people, and to where we're going, which is seen and unseen, reaching into contemporary society.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess what strikes me as I reflect on my own story, it was that my kind of journey out of faith and my journey back into faith was actually through people rather than through books and ideas. Books and ideas might have helped that, but the thing that turned me away from faith was seeing inauthentic Christian life, a Christian life which didn't ring true, where I sensed the people I was engaging with lived a kind of double life, a life that had no integrity to it, and that turned me away from Christian faith. But actually what drew me back to Christian faith was the exact opposite. Well, it was the same, but the opposite is the same, being that it was people. So I wasn't convinced back into Christian faith primarily by reading books and ideas, but it was people who embodied Christian faith, people living lives of real Christian integrity, where I sensed they had a depth of compassion for the disadvantage that I couldn't quite imagine myself having, a kind of gentleness that I kind of envied, a sense that they were committed to me, even though I was quite rude about their own faith at the time and was pretty critical of them. And they didn't give up on me, and that's what drew me back. And so I suppose, now at the same time, thinking about faith, the intellectual journey was always an important part of that for me. As it's always been, going on to study theology and write books and everything else. But it just struck me that it's people that embody Christian faith, and it's people that either turn us away or towards Christian faith. So I guess that's my first observation. I guess the second one is this thing about the nature of faith. You drew attention to this, you picked up this phrase about rejecting a childish faith, and the distinction between a childlike and a childish faith. And I guess that maybe the heart of that is that at the heart of Christian faith is this. It is simple trust. I mean, I spent a lot of time teaching and writing on Martin Luther, and of course, great idea at the heart of Martin Luther's teaching is justification by faith, justitia fides in the Latin. But I often think that that's best translated as not justification by faith, but justification by trust. Because what he means by that is not justification by believing the right things, but justification by trusting the word of God to you. It's personal trust. And that's what childlike faith is like. You simply trust your Heavenly Father, just like a child trusts their own mother or father. So there's a childlike faith that's like that. But a childish faith is where you don't go beyond that to explore its intellectual coherence, its kind of its weight, its gravity, its power to change the whole of life, and you don't begin to then rethink your whole world from that perspective. And so, if you like, I think a childlike faith, in other words, one that simply trusts God, the God of Jesus Christ revealed to us in Jesus Christ, has to go on into a kind of adult faith where you grow up into Christ, which does involve the mind. It does involve rethinking the whole of reality in the light of this simple trust in the God who's revealed in Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit.
Wow, I love your distinction there between faith and trust, and unpacking what Luther might have been getting at, because it brings to mind the work of Jesus when he was here, when he came, which was to flip the script on everything, to help the new wine, and to try to achieve new wine skins in a world that had become calcified, right, in dogma, and in this case legalistic dogma versus theological dogma. But sometimes we see in the church theological dogma where, to your point, these are creeds that you must believe. You must believe this particular formulation, whether you can wrap your head around it or not, versus trust, right? One of the things that I thought of when you were saying that was my son, who when he was 2, particularly my son more than my daughter, But my son would ask why incessantly
Mm.
and over and over and over again. And no matter what you said, he would just say, why, when he
Yep.
was 2. And you would answer that, and then he would say, why? And you would answer that, and he would say, why? And you would, and he would actually come up with these sort of fantastic, in the sense that completely unrealistic, understanding of what you had tried to explain to him. But he was so trusting as he was seeking answers.
Yep.
Knock and you shall find, seek and knock and it shall be open, you seek and you shall find. So it's, again, the difference between trust and faith to me was interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's a good theological method that your son had, in the sense that, when any question comes, it seems to me a really good theological habit to kind of ask why. And you read a bit of the Bible you don't understand, and you ask, well, why? And you don't give up on that question. You keep on asking why. That's how theology works. At the end of the day, I mean, it's a bit like when your kid asks why. And at the end of the day, you just have to say, well, I don't know why it is. That's just the way it is. You end up with something which you can't explain why. You just assume that it's the case on things. And there's an element of that in theology, that at the end of the theological pursuit is simply trust. That's where it begins and that's where it ends. I think that's certainly true for Luther. You think of someone like Thomas Aquinas, who at the end of his life, having written the great Summa, they're one of the greatest explorations and expositions of Christian faith in theological history, has this extraordinary experience of the presence of God at the end of his life, and he thinks, well, all I've written is but straw in comparison to this vision. And it seems to me that trust is what begins the theological search, but it also ends the theological search. But in between, you have to keep on asking the question why, because that's part of loving God with your mind and trying to understand more of the God that you come to know and worship and pray to. And the more you understand the way, the who that God is, the more you're drawn to his beauty and glory, and the more you're drawn to pray and to live your life in his presence and so on. And so that seems to be a lot of the way theology works. It begins with trust, it ends with trust, but in the middle, there's a lot of why questions.
Yeah, I think of Daniel, who, was given this magnificent revelation, and at the end, he's like, I don't know, I don't understand this. And God's answer was, go thy way, Daniel. It's not for you. But in the end, the wise will understand. That's a fascinating situation.
Yeah, you get the same in so many of the stories in the Bible. The book of Job is another example of someone who constantly asks the question why. And even when his counselors come along and give him some nice, easy answers, he says, no, that's not good enough. I need to keep on asking. And yet at the end of the book, he finds resolution, not so much in a philosophical theorem, but because God simply appears to him. And he repents in dust and ashes, and he sort of says, now, once I heard of you, now I see you. It's a kind of foretaste of the coming of God to us in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, where we can sort of see God in the flesh, as it were. But it seems to me that ultimately our questions are answered by, not so much by a kind of philosophical idea, but by an encounter with God. But that doesn't take away the importance of the intellectual search, the kind of asking of the questions. And, good theology works with both of those things, the experiential openness to an encounter with God, but also the intellectual journey to seek to understand this God and the way he works better and better throughout our lives.
Well, I think that's a great point to take a quick break. And when we come back, unpack how this view and these experiences growing up and coming of age have led you to where you're at today and the work you're doing today. We'll be right back with more of Graham Tomlin on Created in the Image of God.
For most people, Blaise Pascal is remembered for a single argument. But Pascal was far more than a philosopher. In just 39 years, he built one of the world's first calculating machines, a precursor of the modern computer, transformed mathematics, pioneered probability theory, and helped shape the modern age. Brilliant, restless, and deeply spiritual, he wrestled with questions of reason, faith, suffering, and what it means to be human. In this book, Graham Tomlin reveals the remarkable life of a thinker whose ideas still echo through science, technology, philosophy, and religion today. Discover the man behind the legend and the mind that helped create the world we live in. Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God. We're here with Graham Tomlin, and as you know, if you've been here from the start, we've been diving into the difference between childlike and childish faith, and growing, maturing, and trusting God, and coming all the way to the end of one's life, experiencing and seeing God more clearly and with more maturity. And in terms of that arc and progression that we have individually, I want to address a question that has come to my attention over the last year or so. And I just love to sort of get different takes from different theologians on this. Here's what I've seen. I spent much of my early years, and when I was full-time in the ministry, with a particular view of the book of Genesis. And that view is, the trees of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. I haven't so much adopted or accepted the idea of a fall and an original sin. I've looked at it more practically, maybe more the way that the Jewish tradition would look at that story versus the theological overlay that Christianity gave it. But still, that statement, you shall not eat of the tree, and if you do, you will surely die. So this statement, that the serpent told Eve, you will become like God, knowing good and evil. But in the last year or so, it struck me like a thunderbolt. When Paul uses that phrase, strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. So here we have the Apostle Paul, in my view, hearkening back to that tree and basically telling us you should now be eating of that tree. And, this poses a theological challenge. I spoke to one theologian, not trying to out that person, I won't mention them, but it was a fascinating, wonderful conversation. But when I said that, the response was, well, that's not biblical. And I thought to myself, well, it's very much biblical. It may not be theologically correct with the prevailing theology. And then my reaction was maybe, well, Jesus being the second Adam and making all things new, did Jesus coming represent that much of a shift to where with the Holy Spirit and under the guidance of God, we're now, there's an age of maturity that has been reached where we're being given more autonomy and authority to venture into those areas of exploration, using our senses, working in what I call the laboratory of creation, using the divine curriculum given in the Word of God and the Revelation, working in the laboratory to come to a fully independent, with God's help, understanding of those why questions. Why is this good? Why is that evil?
Yeah, I guess when I read
I know
that,
there's a lot there, and I just sprung it on you.
Yeah. I guess when I read that text about the knowledge of good and evil, I guess the way I've always read it is, at least, well, not sure I've always read it this way, but the way I've come to read it is that what is being put before the the human race at that point in its kind of development is that in the beginning, humankind only knew good. We knew this garden of delight into which God had placed us. We knew the
childlike innocence.
Yeah, we knew the presence of God walking in the shade of the evening. We only knew good, and yet in that sort of symbolic taking of the fruit, in disobedience to God, in other words, striking out in independence from God, from that point onwards, we knew not just good, but we also knew evil. And so that's what it means, that the tree of the fruit, the fruit of the tree of good and evil is that we now know not just unadulterated goodness, which is what our original intention was, what God's intention was for us, but we now knew good and evil at the same time. We knew what it was to be in God's presence. We knew what it was to be at some distance from him and to kind of moved away from him. And therefore, from that point onwards, it seems to me that there is this inevitable discernment that has to take place as to what is good and what is evil, because part of the nature of evil, or at least at the heart of the nature of evil, is confusion. It's that evil does not show itself as evil. Evil doesn't proclaim itself, here it is, I'm evil, here it is. It always masks itself as goodness. And Satan presents himself as an angel of light. And therefore, there is a genuine human confusion as over what is good and what is evil. How do you do that? And that's something which it takes a great deal of discernment intellectually, spiritually, and in all kinds of ways to discern that. So I think when St. Paul talks about that sort of discernment of the knowledge of discernment between good and evil, he's talking about us in our, if you like, in our fallen state, that as creatures who know both good and evil but can't always tell the difference, spiritual maturity is coming to be able to tell what the difference is between good and evil. And that takes training. It takes time. It takes learning. It's not something we instinctively do, even when we come to Christ. And so I think that's kind of what's happening there. Things that part of maturity as a human being is learning to discover what is the difference between good and evil, to be able to recognize goodness as what it is, and to recognize evil for what it is, and to be able to turn away from evil and turn back towards the good. And it seems to me that in the new creation, as we look forward to that day when the world will be flooded with the presence of God as we're promised. People often ask the question, well, will we be able to sin in heaven? Will we be able to sin in the new creation? And I guess my answer is, well, we will, but we would be able to, but we never would. We'd never want to, because we will see evil for the ugly and repulsive and horrible thing that it is. And our attitude would be, why would you ever want to do that? It's like sort of eating rotten food. You'd never do it because it's just so ugly and repulsive. You could, in theory, do it, but you wouldn't want to. And so there seems to be that's the trajectory we go on. And then one day we will be able to tell clearly the difference between good and evil. But this life is a journey of discovering the difference and being able to discern rightly between good and evil. That is our calling in this life.
Well, I love your explanation. It makes perfect sense. And I think for me, what it does is it shines a light again on when we try to get too rigid in our theology and dogma, then sometimes we see that the rigid part of it, the dogma part of it, doesn't make sense, and maybe there's a more expansive way of looking at things, or a softer, gentler way of looking at things versus somebody else's attempt to describe in very specific terms what it is that we're meant to see or understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to undermine sound doctrine. Yeah. But rather, but this leads into what I want to understand about seen and unseen and how to work in contemporary society. Because surprisingly, in a way, since the Enlightenment, we've seen a great drop-off of faith, right? The Enlightenment has led to millions of people abandoning belief in God, which is, counterintuitive for those who follow a spiritual path and the concept of enlightenment. But I think part of it is that again, the old wineskin and new wine effect, where humanity is growing in its understanding. The Enlightenment did bring so much discovery, so much deeper insight into nature and how the creation is really structured, such that some things began to no longer make sense, or holes could be poked in certain past beliefs. The primary example, of course, is Copernicus and Galileo, and I don't mean that as a cheap one-dimensional shot, but rather that kind of thing may be happening in other ways since the Enlightenment.
Yeah. I mean, I've learned a lot on this through. I a couple of years ago wrote a biography of Blaise Pascal, the great French philosopher, scientist, theologian, and he sees someone in the 17th century writing at the very early stages of what became the Enlightenment. I mean, he's kind of pre-Enlightenment in many ways, but he's right at the cutting edge of the kind of emerging science of European life in the 17th and then on to the 18th century. And yeah, he made a very important distinction between the ways or epistemology, to use that kind of formal phrase of it. So the way you know about the natural world, he says, we know that through experimental science. He was one of the pioneers of experimental science. He said, we know about biology or about sort of molecular makeup of things, or we know about physics or about the existence of a vacuum or whatever, not because Aristotle said it was right or because of some philosophical theorem, but we do it through experiments. We do it through experiments. We do experiments. We try them again and again, and we work out what's the best explanation of those of the results we get from experiments. So he's one of the real pioneers of experimental science. And he says that's really useful when it comes to things like science, or things like discovering historical facts or whatever it might be. But he makes a big distinction between that and the knowledge of God, because he thinks the knowledge that God is not another object within the world that we can examine, like a chemical compound or a historical event or a kind of a thing that we've made in the world where you can sort of go back by cause and effect to see where it was. God is not that kind of being. He stands outside the world, not sort of within it, if you like. And therefore, the experimental method is of limited use when it comes to God. Belief in God, he thinks, is something that comes from the heart. It comes from a kind of deep instinct we have that sort of makes sense of things, that there is a God who created this world and has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. And I think that the problem with the later Enlightenment was that people like David Hume and others kind of didn't get that distinction, or at least confused that distinction, and said, well, okay, we got the experimental method that'll tell us what's true in the world of science. We'll extend it into theology as well, and we will try experiments on God, and we will try to see, where's the evidence for the existence of God. And the evidence for the existence of God is you can argue it both ways, as Pascal always argued, and therefore, because there was not 100% foolproof proof of God, they then reverted to saying, well, you can't be sure of God, and therefore we must put him to one side and not believe in him any longer. And that's why I think this distinction that Pascal made is quite a useful one for us. And that was where the Enlightenment went wrong, not so much in adopting the scientific method, but assuming that the scientific methods could somehow get you to God, which Pascal realized you couldn't do.
So thank you for digging into the historical facts of that. You've given sort of, by bringing up Pascal and Hume, whom I'm only vaguely familiar with. I mean, I studied more Hume than Pascal back in the day, but you've kind of given the foundation for something that I've taken on as my personal belief and tried to explain. I have the sun and moon behind me here on the wall, and they remind me constantly that God put the greater and lesser lights in heaven to rule the day and night, to shed light, and that when we submit to the light, we retain our sovereignty. When we deviate from the light, even to one degree, we tend in towards darkness, and we become enslaved to something or someone, right? By abdicating our sovereignty, which we retain when we submit to the light. So, but beyond that, God created time and space by definition of he put the lights in heaven and the heavenly bodies, and it says the stars. The Bible's not a scientific textbook, but there it is, Einstein right there in the book of Genesis. He set the bodies in motion, and they were for days, seasons, signs, and times, right? So my point being, that God that sits outside of time and space, and this gets to seen and unseen, and I want you to share more about what that is, because he's the most hidden of the hidden and the most manifest of the manifest. What that means to me is that Hebrews, chapter 6, he that would come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder. You must believe those two things, that he intends good things for you. If you don't think he is, or you think he's just, detached and not engaged, he will be hidden from you. You will not and never will find him through scientific exploration. He will not allow himself to be poked and probed by somebody who's trying to disprove him, right? However, if you do believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of good, then the whole creation declares his glory, and this speech pours forth. So even through scientific experimentation, with the right belief or faith orientation, that's why the Enlightenment happens. In true enlightenment.
Yeah, and I think, you picked up the theme there of the hiddenness of God, and of course for Pascal that was a very big theme that he wrote a great deal about, the hiddenness of God. That God, if there is a God, he said, he must be a hidden God, because he's not obvious. In other words, you can go through this life and not encounter God at all, or at least think you haven't encountered God. And it is possible to be atheist. It is possible to go through this because you don't see God, you don't feel him, you walk down the street, he doesn't normally talk to you in a kind of very obvious way. And therefore the atheist will say, well, there's no evidence for God, therefore I don't believe in him. And then that's where the kind of traditional Christian apologetics comes in and says, oh, well, I can give you 10 reasons why God exists, and here they are. Pascal was never that convinced about how well they worked. largely because he thought we are, our sort of fallen human hearts don't want to believe in God, and so we find reasons why why he doesn't exist anyway, and also because he thinks they're not those reasoning isn't psychologically powerful for us. But he kind of makes a virtue out of it and saying, well, actually, it's not that there's an obvious God or no God. There's a third possibility that there is a God, but he's a hidden God, and he's always a hidden God. And he's so hidden in the sense that even in the place where we think he is most clearly revealed, or where Christians say he's most clearly revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, even there God is hidden. In other words, you could meet Jesus Christ, you could shake him by the hand, you could talk to him, and you could entirely miss the fact that you were talking to God.
A really nice guy, right?
Exactly.
He's a really nice guy.
Even in the flesh of Jesus Christ, God is hidden.
Yeah.
And Pascal is a good Catholic. He would say, within the bread and wine of the Mass, the Holy Communion, God is hidden there as well. So in every way, God is hidden. He approaches to us in a hidden way, and we have to discern behind the things that are visible, the invisible, which brings on to the kind of seen and the unseen elements of it, and which is why I think again you were using examples of the sun. It seems to me that that you can't look at the sun. If you do, you will go blind pretty quickly.
Right.
What you can do is you can look at other things in the light that the sun sheds. And in fact, if the sun did not shed its light, we wouldn't be able to see anything. In fact, when the sun is, when the earth turns and we don't get the sun's light, that's when the darkness comes. Now, that seems to be quite a good example of what it is when we're trying to kind of understand something of God, and certainly trying to convey to others the difference that faith in God, faith in Jesus Christ means. And that is that you can try to kind of explain God, but that's a difficult thing to do. It's not easy to explain God and to try to capture him in words. But what you can do is you can show how the light of Jesus Christ makes a difference to everything that you look at. And so, I think it's that phrase that C.S. Lewis had, didn't he? I believe in God like I believe in the sun, not because I can see it, but because through its light I can see everything else. And it seems to me that's the way in which we communicate Christian faith today. And so I guess seen and unseen is something that we started up 3 or 4 years ago. It largely came out of my experience as a bishop in the Church of England, working with churches who were trying to share Christian faith in their different settings, and finding actually that in a place like kind of post-Christian Britain, it's kind of stony ground. I often think about that parable of the sower, where Jesus talks about sowing seed, but if it falls on stony ground, it doesn't really kind of take root very much. And it feels a bit like that in a kind of cynical, secular, post-Christian Britain. Maybe things are turning a little bit now, but that's what it kind of felt like. And so the thought was, rather than sowing more seed, we've got to plow up the ground a little bit. And we plow up the ground by helping people to see what difference it makes when you look at the world through the lens of Christian faith. So we set up Seen and Unseen as a website which gives a kind of Christian theological commentary on what's happening in culture. And so if there's a story in the news, there's a story in politics or in economics or in sort of global affairs or whatever it might be, we will usually kind of have a theologian write about that, but not in a very academic treatise way, kind of long, complicated articles, but sort of shorter, more journalistic style of writing, which is taking an issue in the kind of current world that we're talking about, and actually looks at it through a theological lens. And it's a kind of something that I've kind of been learning to do a bit more myself in recent times. And so the website itself, as I say, it's called seenandunseen.com. It has at the moment, if you go on it, it's got an article on holidays. We're going on holiday in the summer, and why we actually take ourselves on our holiday. We never quite escape from ourselves on holiday, and holiday somehow means we have to address what's going on inside ourselves. You've got articles on the World Cup, and how we understand what was going on there in the different sort of elements of the competition that was happening then, and how Christian faith helps you see that differently. And it will have articles on, we got a new Prime Minister in the United Kingdom as we speak today, Andy Burnham, thinking about what he brings to kind of politics and how Christian faith helps you interpret that. We'll have reviews of films and books and so on, all of which trying to help people look at the world through the lens of Christian faith and showing how Christian faith makes a difference to everything. It changes your whole way of life, your whole way of thinking, rather than just having a kind of religious segment of your life over here and the rest of life carries on as before. So that's largely the kind of idea behind it. And it was both trying to kind of help theologians to write in a more kind of accessible way, but also to help those outside the church to realize actually Christian faith does make a difference to the way you see the world, but also helping the church learn the skills of cultural literacy to show that Christian faith has something to say about everything that's happening in our world. It has a relevance to everything, rather than just a little tiny corner of religious reality that we sometimes think about.
And how do you select the writers for this and the topics? I interview a lot of people twice a week. I'm doing this, and some of them come to mind as perhaps being able to contribute something to that. Are you looking for people to contribute? Do you have a stable set of writers?
Yeah, we've had about 200 writers writing for us. We've published about just well over 2,000 articles in the last few years. We probably do about between 5 and 10 articles a week. We have a number of podcasts that come out on it. I guess what we're looking for is people who have a sort of theological background, ideally, someone who can bring a bit of theological wisdom to it, someone who has people who've got skills in writing for a more popular audience, but without losing the theological depth. We're writing deliberately for an audience outside the church. We're not a kind of internal church Christianity magazine, which is simply writing for the Christian audience. We don't tend to run stories on internal church matters. We'll always run stories. If there's a story in the news, we'll write about that. We won't necessarily write stories about, things that are only of interest to Christians. So yeah, the answer is we are looking for people to write to us.
Here's a thought, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but years ago, when I was actually a student, I was given this opportunity to be an intern to the Director of Communications and Public Affairs for a man named David Hume, Hulme, right? Okay. And he was kind of like the spokesperson for the denomination, and he worked with advertising agencies. There was this magazine called Advertising Age, and I saw in it a series of ads for the 7 deadly sins. And I'm now 2/3 of the way through an article series called The 7 Deadly Virtues, and how each of these sins has been reclassified today as a virtue. And it, going back to, this was back in the 80s, where it was kind of like a joke. And, imagine if we could take and make sin popular. Could advertising agencies do that? In fact, they could. And in fact, we have. Each of those sins has been made popular today, whether it's lust or greed or, even sloth, you wouldn't think. But yes, those things can be rebranded. Is that the kind of thing that might be of interest? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we did a series on the 7 deadly sins a little while ago. In fact, I read a book on the 7 deadly sins, thinking about the 7 deadly sins, the way they have become kind of reappropriated, and the corresponding Christian virtues. So why is pride a sin and humility a virtue? Because in the ancient world, humility wasn't particularly a virtue at all. In the Greek world, humility was something appropriate for slaves, but not for kind of well-born people. It's the one deadly sin, I think, which maybe hasn't been as accommodated as others, is envy. I think we still think envy is not a good thing to have. We still have it.
Well, here's what I wrote about envy, and Thomas Sowell wrote about this. I assume you're familiar with who he is. He talked about how social justice has rebranded envy as a virtue. Right. Yeah, looking around, comparing oneself to others, which Paul says don't do that, and then saying I should have that, and then creating a whole construct around why I should have that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Why it's not righteous or good that I don't have that, and not to take away from some of the underlying structural and historical problems, but that's how that was done in my view. Even envy is today a virtue.
Yeah. I guess what we try to do on Seen and Unseen is sometimes not so much start from theological ideas, but start from issues that are in contemporary life. So we will look at stuff that's going on in the news and websites and so on, whether here in the UK or in the US or whatever. And we will try to kind of see it through a kind of a biblical lens. So, for example, I was in the US a couple of months ago and spent some time on the West Coast and spent time on the East Coast. And I kind of found myself thinking about the story of the United States. And you know, the story is of, you know, the Pilgrim Fathers coming over to escape the constriction of European life to create this land of the free. And they kind of landed on the East Coast and created new societies there, these new pioneers. And then further on, they went west and they created across the Rockies and created a new civilization on the other side. You had these pioneers, you know, who kind of were rough and ready. They kind of broke the rules. They didn't follow what they were supposed to do. They sort of shot from the hip. They were often quite, they deliberately didn't follow the rules. But then following on behind the pioneers, you had the settlers, those who had to build institutions and cities and universities and towns and banks and so on. And it seems to me in kind of American life, there's always this kind of the pioneer mindset and the settler mindset. And it struck me how, you know, the pioneer mindset, people who you can sort of see it in people who drive around in sort of pickup trucks with military fatigues and big beards and tattoos everywhere and rifles in the back. And, you know, it's not too subtle, but they're kind of, you know, fighting the bears and camping out in the woods and going hunting and that kind of thing. And why someone like Donald Trump kind of appeals to that kind of person. But then you get the settlers, those who are more comfortable in cities and in kind of institutions and so on. And why sort of Barack Obama would appeal to those kind of people. And the story that seemed to me to make sense of that was the Jacob and Esau story in the Old Testament. You know, Esau is the pioneer, the hunter, the kind of unsubtle, you know, kind of, you know, person who doesn't think, just acts.
Impulsive, yeah.
Exactly. Whereas Jacob is the kind of the slightly more crafty. He's more subtle. He thinks about things quite carefully. He and there's a tense relationship between those two people throughout the Bible, just as there's a tense relationship between the two kind of traditions within American life. Yeah, the great thing about that story, of course, is that they have a reconciliation. Jacob and Esau reconcile to each other. And that gives hope that, you know, the polarization of American life that I was very aware of when I was there might find some sort of reconciliation through a kind of mutual encounter with God, which is kind of what happens with the Jacob and Esau story. So that's just an example of trying to look at a contemporary issue through the lens of the Bible and Christian theology and trying to shed a new light on it and trying to give some hope to it in a way that you wouldn't otherwise see.
Well, I love that. And normally we would quickly go to a break and quickly come back, but we've gone long. So in the interest of time, I'll just put the last question to you as we sort of crash land this plane, which we've been enjoying flying in. So where are you growing next? What's next on the horizon for you, for seen and unseen? And what can people look forward to, and maybe how can they engage?
Yeah, well, with seen and unseen, it's really good to see over the last 3 or 4 years gaining a reputation for really rich theological commentary on culture, which is accessible for ordinary Christians. You don't have to be a kind of high-flying theologian to read it, but you will access really good, thoughtful material commenting on what's going on in culture. And it's gaining a really good reputation, certainly on this side of the pond, but also in the US as well. For that kind of material. One of the things we're working on at the moment is a project on what's sometimes called Christian nationalism. You know, how do we relate the nation to the Christian faith? It's a kind of controversial issue in the USA. It's controversial here as well. And I guess our question is, what can we dig underneath that? You know, what's going on in our debates around Christian nationalism? What's going on underneath our fears for it or our attraction to it? In that debate, and we're commissioning a series of articles on it. A book will come out, a series of conversations, and so that's something to kind of look out for, you know, over the next year as we do this work. And so that's one thing that's there. I mean, we're always looking for kind of new writers and people who have this real sort of gift and calling and skill, you know, to write accessible theological commentary on culture at the same time. The other project I'm working on at the moment is it's always struck me how in the United States, one of the things you talk about quite a lot is your own civil war, which was a kind of crucial thing that that influences contemporary America in all kinds of ways. In France, they talk about their French Revolution a great deal. Here in the UK, we don't talk about our own civil war much at all. We had one back in the 16 sort of 40s. And yeah, I actually think it actually lies underneath so many of the issues that we talk about in contemporary British life today. And so I want to try to make a case as for how that historical period has shaped the modern world. And I guess that's what, and it's part of, I think, this story of trying to help people realize how Christian faith has profoundly shaped our kind of modern world, because our civil war was largely a kind of fight over what kind of Christian faith we wanted to hold as a nation. It was an internal Christian battle. Now, that doesn't excuse what happened as a result of that, but it was an internal Christian debate which has given rise to what our world, what we fight over today. And it makes you realize that sort of secularism is quite a new thing. It's quite a recent thing. And secularism itself is a kind of Christian heresy. It's something that couldn't have come into being apart from Christian faith. And so it's part of helping people to understand how profoundly Christian faith has influenced our culture, whether here in the United Kingdom or in the United States or whatever. So there's some of the things we're working on for the future.
Well, definitely fascinating and interesting and intriguing. I'm going to be spending a little time digging through what's available on seenandunseen.com. Graham, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and I appreciate, again, your flexibility in making the time work. Any last thoughts for the audience as we wrap up today?
Yeah, well, it's great to be part of this conversation and to explore the nature of Christian faith. And I think I guess one of the texts I keep coming back to is that text, I think it's in Hosea, that says, "Let us strive to know the Lord." And it's a simple phrase, "Let us strive to know the Lord." And it seems to me that's one of the key callings that maybe on all of our lives. It's something I've always felt quite is a calling on my life, that actually this life, there's all kinds of things that we do in it, but maybe as I get older, the more I think that's almost the most crucial thing we ever do, to come to know the Lord. Who is this God who made us, who brought us into being, who loved us in Jesus Christ, to whom we will one day return, before whose face we will one day appear? Who is this God? And so let us strive. And it's striving, that word means taking a bit of effort. It means some reading and thinking and praying. And to make that your kind of life's calling through whatever path God has led you to, whatever job you do, whatever your family circumstances, wherever you live, and so on. I think of striving to know the Lord, I think is a crucial thing for me, and I think hopefully it might be for some of your listeners as well.
Well, that's an amazing thought to leave us with. Thank you for pulling that out of Hosea and bringing it into light in this modern contemporary age. Graham, thanks again for your time being here. My sign off is simply to remind the audience, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. Stay tuned for the sneak peek, which will tell you what to look forward to next week. And Graham, we'll be following you and seenandunseen.com as you continue to unpack all of this for contemporary society.
Great. Thank you, Wade. Really good to talk today.
Appreciate that.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, August 16th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Steve Besner, pastor, professor, and author. He reflects on how culture can shape our understanding of faith and why following Jesus often means choosing kingdom values over cultural ones. From discipleship and spiritual formation to becoming more like Jesus in a world full of competing priorities. And then on Tuesday, August 18 at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Dan Allender, therapist, professor, and author. He explores the connection between trauma, healing, and the Christian story, and how God meets us in the deepest places of our pain. From wounded hearts and broken stories, to restoration, hope, and the healing found through Christ. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in